The smell of roasted turkey still takes me back to that night, the night my life split cleanly into before and after. Christmas lights were blinking softly around the room, the kind that are supposed to make everything feel warm and safe. Laughter had filled the house earlier, the kind that sounds real on the surface, but hides years of unspoken tension underneath. I remember sitting at the dining table, hands folded in my lap, telling myself to stay calm, to just get through dinner. I had no idea that within minutes, my own father would look me in the eye and say words that would echo in my head for years. Get out. And never come back. Christmas dinner at my dad's house was never easy. From the outside, we looked like a normal family. A decorated tree, wrapped gifts, plates passed around the table. But inside, there was always pressure, expectations, judgments. My dad believed in a very specific version of success, and in his eyes, I had failed to live up to it. He wanted me to follow the path he had chosen, work where he thought I should work, live the way he approved of. I didn't argue much anymore. I had learned that silence was safer. That night, I thought if I kept my head down, I could survive one more holiday. As the conversation turned to careers and money, I felt my chest tighten. Relatives shared updates about promotions, new cars, big plans. Then all eyes shifted to me. My dad cleared his throat and asked, in that tone I knew too well, what I was doing with my life now. I gave a simple answer, careful not to say too much. I didn't mention the long nights, the risks I had taken, or the quiet progress I had made. I had learned that sharing my dreams only made things worse. But my answer wasn't enough. It never was. He laughed, not kindly, and said I was wasting my time. He said I was embarrassing him. The words stung, but I tried to let them pass. Then he stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor, and the room went silent. He pointed toward the door and said I was no longer welcome in his house. He said if I wanted to live life my way, I could do it without him. Get out and never come back, he said, right there at Christmas dinner in front of everyone. No one stopped him. No one defended me. I remember standing up slowly, my hands shaking as I grabbed my coat. The Christmas lights blurred as my eyes filled with tears. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I just walked out into the cold night, the door closing behind me with a final sound that felt heavier than any slam. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the freezing air, wondering how a family gathering could turn into complete rejection in seconds. That night, I felt small, alone, like I had lost the one place I thought I could always return to, no matter what. I didn't have a backup plan. I didn't have anyone waiting for me. What I did have was a quiet fire inside me, one that had been burning for years. I didn't know exactly where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't let that moment define the rest of my life. As I walked away from that house, I promised myself something. I promised that I would build a life so strong that no one could ever throw me out of it again. What my dad didn't know, what no one at that table knew, was that I wasn't as lost as I seemed. I had been building something in silence. Something risky. Something most people would have laughed at if I had said it out loud. While they saw uncertainty, I saw possibility. While they measured success by titles and approval, I was learning how to create value from nothing. I was learning how to fail quietly and keep going. That Christmas dinner wasn't the end of my story. It was the push I didn't know I needed. In the months and years that followed, I faced setbacks that made that night feel easy by comparison. There were moments when I questioned everything, when I wondered if my dad had been right. But every time I thought about giving up, I remembered his voice telling me to leave and never come back. And instead of breaking me, it fueled me. I worked when others slept. I learned when others doubted. I took risks that scared me because fear had already lost its power over me that night. This isn't just a story about family drama or a Christmas dinner gone wrong. It's a story about rejection, resilience, and what happens when you're forced to choose between approval and purpose. It's about the quiet journeys people never see, the ones that don't look impressive until they suddenly are. It's about how being pushed out can sometimes be the only way to truly step into who you're meant to become. Years later, my life looks very different. The things I once dreamed about in silence became real in ways I never fully imagined. The success didn't come overnight, and it didn't come without cost. But it came honestly. It came from believing in myself when the people closest to me didn't. And one day, that same man who told me to get out would hear a truth that would change how he saw me forever. But that moment didn't happen yet. Not that night. Not for a long time. As I walked away from my dad's house on that cold Christmas evening, I had no idea how far the road ahead would take me, or how high the stakes would become. All I knew was that I had been cast out, and I had a choice to make: disappear into bitterness, or turn that pain into something powerful. And the choice I made would set everything else in motion. I didn't go anywhere special that night. I drove until the streets felt unfamiliar, until the houses lost their decorations and the holiday music faded into silence. I parked near a closed grocery store and sat there with the engine off, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. They were still shaking. I wasn't crying anymore, but my chest felt tight, like something heavy was sitting there and refusing to move. I kept replaying my dad's words, wondering how easily he had said them, how final they sounded. Part of me hoped he would call, that someone would run outside and tell me to come back. My phone stayed dark. I ended up crashing on a friend's couch that night. He didn't ask many questions, and I didn't offer many answers. I told him I just needed a place to sleep. Lying there in the dark, listening to someone else's house settle, I felt like a guest in my own life. I thought about my childhood, about how hard my dad had worked to build his reputation, how much he cared about appearances. Love in our house had always felt conditional. Do well, and you were praised. Fail, and you were reminded of it constantly. I had spent years trying to earn a kind of approval that never fully came. Growing up, I was the quiet one. I didn't cause trouble. I didn't rebel in obvious ways. Instead, I stayed up late reading, learning, imagining a future that didn't fit neatly into anyone else's plans for me. When I first started talking about doing things differently, starting something of my own, my dad shut it down fast. He said it wasn't realistic. He said people like us didn't take risks like that. So I stopped talking about it. I learned how to nod, smile, and keep my real thoughts to myself. What no one saw was how serious I was. While others were chasing quick wins, I was obsessed with understanding how systems worked, how money moved, how ideas turned into value. I didn't come from money. I didn't have connections. All I had was time, curiosity, and a stubborn belief that there had to be another way. I made mistakes early on, lost small amounts of money, trusted the wrong people. Each failure taught me something, even when it hurt my pride. After that Christmas, I threw myself deeper into my work. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I didn't know how else to survive. Working gave me structure. It gave me a reason to wake up. I took temporary jobs to cover rent while pouring every extra hour into my projects. Some nights, I slept with my laptop open, notes scattered across the floor. Other nights, I stared at the ceiling, wondering if I was chasing an illusion. The doubt never fully went away. It just learned how to sit quietly in the background. The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the financial stress. It was the loneliness. Holidays came and went without invitations. Birthdays passed with short text messages, if that. My dad never reached out. Neither did most of the family who had watched me walk out that night. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. I told myself I didn't need them, but there were moments when I missed the idea of family, even if the reality had been painful. Still, things slowly started to shift. Small wins came first. A deal that worked out. A product that finally gained traction. Numbers that moved in the right direction. I didn't celebrate much. I had learned not to announce progress too early. I kept my circle small, and my plans even smaller. The more things improved, the more cautious I became. I knew how quickly it could all disappear. Sometimes, late at night, I imagined what it would be like to sit at that same Christmas table again. Not to prove anything, not to argue, but just to be seen. To have my dad ask real questions, to listen without judgment. I didn't know if that moment would ever come, and part of me wondered if I even wanted it anymore. Success changes you, but so does rejection. It teaches you where not to look for validation. As the years passed, my life filled with things I never talked about publicly. Meetings in unfamiliar cities. Conversations that carried serious weight. Decisions that affected more than just me. On the outside, I still looked ordinary. I dressed simply. I avoided attention. I liked it that way. People underestimate you when they think they understand you. That misunderstanding became a kind of shield. Every once in a while, I'd hear updates about my dad through distant relatives. He would ask about me, casually, as if we were still on speaking terms. He would shake his head and say I was stubborn, that I'd learn eventually. Each time, it stung, but it also reminded me why I stayed quiet. The truth had power, and I wasn't ready to use it. The closer I got to achieving what I had once only imagined, the more complicated my feelings became. Part of me wanted to reach out, to bridge the gap before it grew any wider. Another part remembered that night too clearly. The way he didn't hesitate. The way the room had gone silent. Trust, once broken, doesn't rebuild itself easily. It takes time. And sometimes, it takes a moment that forces everything into the open. By then, my work had grown into something much bigger than I had planned. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about impact, about proving that quiet determination could outlast loud doubt. I still carried the weight of that Christmas dinner with me, but it felt different now. Less like a wound, more like a reminder of where I started. I didn't know when or how our paths would cross again. I didn't know what I would say if they did. All I knew was that the story wasn't finished. The words my dad had spoken still hung in the air, unresolved, waiting for an answer that hadn't been given yet. And when that answer finally came, it would change everything for both of us. The winter months after that Christmas were some of the coldest I'd ever experienced, both outside and inside. The snow coated the streets, turning the city into a quiet, reflective landscape, but I didn't feel the peace most people associate with it. I felt the absence of my family's approval, like a weight pressing on my chest. Friends tried to cheer me up, inviting me to gatherings, sending holiday greetings, but their kindness couldn't fill the gap left by my dad's words. Get out and never come back. Those words repeated in my head like a broken record, a reminder that I had been abandoned when I needed support most. In that silence, I found myself thinking more about my dad than I wanted to. I remembered the man he used to be before the pressure of his own ambitions hardened him. I remembered late nights when he'd help me with school projects or watch me perform in small talent shows. Somewhere along the way, that version of him disappeared. He became someone who measured love with achievement, someone who saw deviation as failure. And that's what made his rejections so sharp. It wasn't random. It was calculated, precise, meant to push me into what he thought was the right life. The conflict between who I was and who he expected me to be became the center of my thoughts, my conversations with friends, even the long walks I took through the city streets. I started noticing things I had overlooked before, how my sister quietly tried to mediate, how my mom had left the room early that night, how certain relatives avoided eye contact. Each person's reaction, or lack of reaction, added another layer to the story, another angle to consider. Family dynamics are complicated, and I was beginning to see just how many silent players had influenced that night's outcome. Meanwhile, my own ambitions were beginning to take shape in ways I hadn't anticipated. I wasn't just working to prove my dad wrong, I was working to prove myself right. I poured hours into learning about business strategies, investments, and technology. I met mentors who challenged me, who didn't care about my family name or background. They cared about results, about vision. They pushed me harder than my father ever had, and the irony wasn't lost on me. While he thought he was building someone who would fit neatly into a conventional life, I was building myself into someone who couldn't be ignored. Despite these successes, the tension from that Christmas never fully left me. Every time I made progress, I thought about what my dad would say if he saw it. Would he be proud? Or would he still see failure? That uncertainty haunted me more than any financial obstacle or business risk. I realized that this wasn't just about money or recognition, it was about approval, about the lingering need for a parent to see you as more than a disappointment. and that desire made the stakes higher than I had expected. Subplots emerged naturally as I navigated this life. My relationship with my sister, for example, became more complex. She had always been closer to my dad, the golden child in his eyes, and yet she reached out in small, cautious ways. Texts that said, "thinking of you," or phone calls that started with awkward silences. I didn't know if she wanted to reconcile, if she had sympathy, or if she simply didn't want to be alone in the family drama. I didn't respond right away. I was wary. But her attempts forced me to examine my own feelings about loyalty, forgiveness, and the fragile bonds that tie family together, even when those bonds are tested. Another layer came from people outside my family. Colleagues, friends, and even competitors noticed changes in me. Some envied my persistence. Others doubted whether I could sustain it. I learned quickly that navigating success in the real world required a different kind of resilience than the kind I had developed at home. Every deal I made, every pitch I delivered, carried the weight of that Christmas with me. The question lingered, could I truly separate the child who had been rejected from the adult I was becoming? Meanwhile, rumors began circulating within my extended family about what I was doing, though details were scarce. Some people assumed I had failed spectacularly. Others, more cautiously, whispered that maybe I had found a way to make it work. I didn't correct them. The mystery worked to my advantage. I learned that perception is a tool, and silence can be more powerful than explanation. I became a ghost in their conversations, an invisible presence that still mattered enough to provoke speculation. The tension with my dad remained the central force in my life. Every holiday, every family event, even casual mentions in conversations, carried the potential for confrontation. I wondered if he thought about me at all, or if my absence had already been absorbed into his narrative of what went wrong. And I realized something unsettling. The longer I stayed out of the family's orbit, the more space I had to grow, but the more distant I became from the people who had shaped me. I was building a future that might one day dwarf the past, but I wasn't sure I wanted that confrontation when it finally arrived. At the same time, I started noticing patterns in myself. The fear of rejection had become a motivator rather than a paralyzer. I worked harder, smarter, and more strategically. I learned how to read people, how to anticipate setbacks, how to pivot without hesitation. Each success, each small victory, brought a mix of satisfaction and anxiety. What if he never acknowledged it? What if the recognition I sought from others felt hollow, without his approval? These questions became an undercurrent to every decision I made, and the tension never let me relax. Even friendships were tested. Some old friends drifted away, unable to understand the obsession with growth, the relentless drive to turn rejection into opportunity. Others stepped in, offering advice, introductions, and sometimes just a listening ear. I realized that choosing who to trust was almost as important as choosing what risks to take. Betrayal could come in unexpected forms, and success made you a target. Every angle of my life seemed connected to that night at Christmas. The silent judgments, the unspoken rules, the drive to prove something that went beyond money. And then there were moments of reflection that unsettled me further. Sometimes, I would imagine my dad watching me from a distance, seeing glimpses of what I had become, without knowing the full story. Would he feel regret? Pride? Resentment? Or would he still measure me by the narrow standards he had imposed, missing the bigger picture entirely? The unknown kept me on edge, a tension that fueled both my ambition and my caution. By now, my life had grown complex, layered with conflict, ambition, and unanswered questions. The story wasn't just about a single Christmas anymore. It was about every choice I had made since, every setback, every triumph, every quiet night spent working towards something no one had seen. And through it all, the central conflict remained. Could I ever reconcile the person I had become with the family I had left behind? Could I step back into their world without losing myself? Or would my presence reignite old wounds that had never healed? The more I built, the more complicated the future became. I knew that one day there would be a reckoning. Not necessarily a confrontation, but a moment where my past and present would collide. And in that collision, nothing would be guaranteed. The tension lingered like a storm on the horizon, unpredictable but inevitable, and I couldn't help but wonder how it would feel when the first lightning struck. Time passed faster than I expected. The seasons changed, and with them, the rhythm of my life grew more intense. My ventures, once small and uncertain, had transformed into something substantial. I had learned to read opportunities before anyone else did, to anticipate the moves of competitors, to turn what seemed like risk into advantage. Yet, with every milestone, a part of me remained tethered to that Christmas night, the memory of my dad's words echoing, sharp and unyielding, "Get out and never come back." They were no longer just painful, they were a compass, pointing me towards something I couldn't yet name. The tension grew with each family update I received through whispered conversations and muted social media posts. My dad had moved on, or so it seemed. He retired from his position at the company he had built, and rumors suggested he had sold off some of his assets. I didn't know whether to feel relief, curiosity, or a complicated mix of both. I realized that my distance from him had grown into something permanent, yet his shadow still stretched across the milestones of my life. Every victory felt incomplete until I imagined the possibility of him seeing it, of finally recognizing what I had accomplished. One evening, my sister called me unexpectedly. I wasn't sure if I should answer. Part of me wanted to keep the silence, the protective barrier I had built. But another part, the part that had always craved connection, made me pick up. Her voice was cautious, hesitant. She asked about my life, about my projects, about everything I had accomplished in quiet anonymity. She didn't say it outright, but I could feel the curiosity and maybe even the fear in her questions. She wanted to know if the stories she had heard were true, if I had really made it. I kept my answers measured, offering enough to satisfy, but never enough to expose all the details. That phone call left me thinking, wondering how close I was to a confrontation I wasn't sure I wanted or feared at the same time. Around the same time, I received invitations to events I would never have imagined attending years before. Industry conferences, private dinners, even speaking engagements where the room waited to hear from me. Every step forward reminded me of the gap between my current life and the Christmas dinner that had started this whole journey. I had grown into a self-made success, yet the memory of being cast out remained fresh, a scar beneath the surface. I realized that with each achievement, the stakes grew higher. If my dad ever found out what I had become, it would be more than a casual shock. It could ignite a confrontation, a reckoning that none of us were ready for. The suspense built quietly at first, in moments when I almost ran into family members in passing, or when someone mentioned him casually, as if he were part of a story I had long left behind. Each mention made my pulse quicken. I imagined scenarios where he would learn the truth, perhaps through the news, perhaps through someone bragging at a social gathering, and I wondered how he would react. Would he be proud? Ashamed? Angry? I couldn't predict it, and that unpredictability made the tension almost unbearable. Then came the series of events that accelerated everything. A distant cousin reached out, claiming that my dad had been asking questions about me, about the businesses I had quietly built. A part of me wanted to ignore it, to continue the silent momentum I had been nurturing for years. But another part, one I had tried to bury, wanted to see his reaction, to finally witness the moment where my absence, my rejection, and my success collided. At the same time, my work demanded more attention than ever. Deals were closing, partnerships were forming, and the world I had built threatened to consume me completely. Each late night, each boardroom negotiation, carried the undercurrent of anticipation. A storm was coming, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. I had trained myself to be resilient, to take calculated risks, but this was different. This was personal. This wasn't about profit margins or market shares. This was about legacy, about pride, about family, and those stakes were infinitely more unpredictable. One particularly cold evening, I found myself standing outside the old family home. I hadn't planned it. I hadn't intended to revisit the place where everything had begun. But I was drawn there by a mixture of nostalgia, curiosity, and a strange need to measure how far I had come. The lights were off, the decorations long gone, and the house felt smaller than I remembered. Memories flooded back, the laughter that wasn't real, the tension that was, and I realized that every step I had taken since that night had been in preparation for a moment like this, whether I had known it or not. As I walked away from the house, I felt the first tremor of the climax building. I could almost hear the confrontation in my head, my dad seeing me not as the child he rejected, but as the adult who had defied every expectation, the adult who had built a life he never imagined possible. I imagined the questions he might ask, the disbelief, the pride, and maybe even the shame. I imagined the room filled with tension, every word measured, every gesture loaded with history. Even my closest friends noticed the change in me. They said I carried a new energy, a sense of anticipation that I couldn't hide. I was waiting for something, though I didn't yet know when or how it would happen. The suspense hung in the air, unspoken but powerful, shaping every decision I made, every plan I laid out, every step I took toward what felt inevitable. And yet, even as the storm approached, I remained careful. I knew that revealing everything too soon could ruin the moment. I had to control the narrative, to ensure that when the truth finally came out, it landed with impact. The timing mattered more than anything. I thought about all the years of silent struggle, of late nights and quiet victories, and I realized that the climax wasn't just about confrontation. It was about the culmination of everything I had built, everything I had endured, and everything I had kept hidden. Each day brought me closer to that moment. Every message, every rumor, every hint that my dad was aware of my success was like a spark in dry grass. The tension grew, electrifying and dangerous, impossible to ignore. I knew that when it finally exploded, it would change everything, not just for me, but for him as well. The anticipation was unbearable, and yet I couldn't turn away. I was drawn forward, toward the confrontation that had been years in the making, toward the moment when past and present would collide. And so I waited. I moved carefully, strategically, aware that everything I had built could shift in a single moment. I was ready for success, but I wasn't yet ready for the emotional storm that loomed ahead. The story was about to reach its peak, the tension about to snap, and the world I had created silently was about to face the reckoning it had been waiting for. Everything hinged on the next encounter, on the next conversation, on the moment my dad finally understood just who I had become. The anticipation was suffocating, but exhilarating. Every heartbeat carried the weight of the past, the uncertainty of the present, and the promise of something monumental. I didn't know exactly how it would unfold, but I could feel the climax building, a force as inevitable as the tide, drawing me toward a moment that could not be avoided. And in that moment, the air itself seemed charged with the tension of years of rejection, ambition, and unspoken truths, leaving me and everyone involved on the edge of everything. Just when I thought the tension had reached its peak, life threw a curveball I never saw coming. One evening, as I was preparing for a high-stakes business meeting that could double the growth of my company, I got a call from an unknown number. The voice on the other end was calm, almost too calm. "I know who you are," the person said. "And your father has been asking questions. But he's not the only one interested." My heart skipped a beat. I had spent years carefully controlling every detail of my life, making sure my success was quiet, almost invisible to the people I used to know. And suddenly, someone else had discovered me. The caller didn't give much information, only that there were people in my father's circle who had begun to pay attention to my accomplishments. Apparently, my success had started rippling in ways I hadn't expected. Investors, family acquaintances, even business rivals who had once dismissed me were now intrigued. And according to the caller, my father was involved in discussions about how my sudden rise could affect his legacy. I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that this wasn't just about personal pride anymore. This was about power, influence, and perception. My private achievements had suddenly become a public matter. That same week, I got an email that escalated the tension further. It was a formal notice from a legal team representing a business partner I had thought long settled. Apparently, there was a dispute over intellectual property tied to a project I had launched years ago, back when I was still barely scraping by. The partner claimed ownership over certain aspects of my work, and the timing was suspiciously convenient. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone close to my father might have orchestrated this to challenge me, to test whether I had really built what I claimed. It was like the past had suddenly reached out and grabbed me, threatening everything I had constructed in silence. My mind raced as I tried to figure out how all these pieces connected. My father's involvement, the whispers through family channels, the sudden legal dispute. It was as if the universe itself had conspired to force a confrontation I wasn't fully prepared for. Every decision I made, every step I had taken to protect my independence and success, now felt precarious. The stakes had grown higher than ever, and I realized the climax of this story wasn't just about proving myself to my father anymore. It was about defending everything I had worked for against forces I hadn't anticipated. Meanwhile, my sister reached out again, this time with a tone I couldn't ignore. She asked to meet in person, and though I hesitated, I agreed. When we met, her eyes held a mixture of fear and urgency. She whispered that my father had made plans to restructure part of his business empire, and that my name had come up repeatedly, not as a casual mention, but as someone who could potentially overshadow him. Suddenly, the family dynamic I thought I understood felt like a minefield. My success, my achievements, were no longer just my own. They were entwined with his legacy, his pride, and the silent battles I had never wanted to fight. That night, lying awake, I realized how close the confrontation had come without me even noticing. The second plot twist had arrived. What I thought was a private journey of self-made success had collided with the world my father controlled, and the collision was unavoidable. The people I had tried to keep at a distance, the rivalries I had ignored, and the family politics I had dismissed, all of it had emerged at once, threatening to disrupt everything. I felt the tension tighten around me like a noose. Every call, every email, every rumor became a potential trigger. I started retracing my steps, thinking about the choices I had made. Every silent decision, every calculated risk, every moment I had kept to myself suddenly felt like it could be used against me, or, depending on how I played it, could serve as my advantage. The realization was both terrifying and thrilling. I understood that I wasn't just preparing for a personal reckoning with my father anymore. I was stepping into a larger game, one that required not just intelligence, but timing, strategy, and emotional resilience. Then came the final hint that the stakes were higher than I imagined. An unexpected visitor showed up at my office, a former colleague I hadn't seen in years. Their expression was serious, almost urgent. They handed me a document that detailed conversations, decisions, and deals that could influence not only my father's perception of me, but also my business credibility. It was a subtle but undeniable message. My father's world and my world were now intertwined, and the choices I made in the next few weeks could tip the balance in ways I wasn't ready to see. I realized something critical. The climax wasn't just approaching, it had begun. Every layer of conflict I had built up over years, the rejection, the silent struggle, the hidden victories, was converging with external pressures I hadn't anticipated. My father's judgment, once distant and personal, was now part of a complex web of influence, ambition, and expectation. Every action I took from this point forward would be under scrutiny, and any misstep could undo everything. Even with all this, I knew I had an edge. I had spent years preparing for this moment, quietly, deliberately, building not just wealth but resilience. I had learned to navigate uncertainty, to anticipate moves, and to stay calm under pressure. But knowing you have the advantage doesn't make the tension any easier. In fact, it heightens it, because now the stakes are more than just personal pride. They are legacy, perception, and power. As the hours ticked closer to the inevitable confrontation, I could feel the suspense building, almost tangible in the air. Every email notification, every phone call, every message from an old connection made my pulse quicken. The story I had lived in private for years was now reaching a point where the secrets, the silent victories, and the long-hidden ambitions could no longer remain hidden. The second plot twist had escalated the conflict beyond anything I had imagined, and the moment of reckoning was no longer just a possibility, it was imminent. I knew one thing for certain. When it all came to a head, nothing would be the same. The tension, the stakes, and the unexpected challenges had created a storm I could no longer control, and the world I had painstakingly built was about to collide with the past I thought I had left behind. The climax was near, and with every passing moment, the suspense grew more unbearable. The question now wasn't whether I would face it, but how I would survive it, and what truths would finally come to light. The day finally arrived when everything I had been preparing for collided in a single, unstoppable moment. I received an invitation to a holiday gathering at my father's house, unexpected, formal, and carefully worded. My sister had slipped the note under my door with a subtle warning. It wasn't just about family anymore. Curiosity, fear, and anticipation collided inside me. For years, I had imagined a confrontation like this in my head, but imagining it and living it were two entirely different things. When I walked through the familiar front door, I felt the air shift. The house smelled the same, pine, roasted food, but it was laced with tension I hadn't felt since that fateful Christmas years ago. My father was there, older, slower, his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything at first, just studied me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. The room went quiet, the same kind of silence that had surrounded his words the night he told me to get out. Only this time, I wasn't the same person who had walked away in tears. He finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, but with an edge of something new. Curiosity, maybe even fear. "I hear you've been doing well for yourself," he said. The words were careful, measured, like a man testing the ground before stepping forward. I nodded, letting the silence stretch. I didn't feel the need to justify or explain. Years of hard work, quiet victories, and relentless determination had prepared me for this. I let my presence speak for itself. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. As we spoke, a mutual acquaintance, someone who had been monitoring both our business dealings, revealed that my father had unknowingly made a deal that directly intersected with one of my ventures. The contract he signed years ago had given me leverage he didn't realize existed. Suddenly, the power dynamic shifted. I wasn't just proving my success to him, I held tangible influence over part of his empire. The revelation hit him hard. The room's tension thickened, every eye drawn to the unspoken stakes now hanging between us. How did you?" he started, but stopped. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I calmly explained the decisions I had made, the risks I had taken, the years of silent effort no one had witnessed. I laid out the facts of my accomplishments, the milestones that had seemed invisible to him for so long. Each word was deliberate, precise, like placing a puzzle piece perfectly into place. I could see the realization dawning in his eyes. He hadn't anticipated that the child he rejected would rise not just to equal him, but to surpass expectations he never set. The room's energy shifted again when my sister spoke up. She revealed that she had been quietly supporting my efforts from behind the scenes, funneling small pieces of information to help me navigate opportunities, even when the rest of the family doubted me. Her revelation hit like a second wave of shock. Our private family struggles had been intertwined in ways I hadn't fully known. I realized that the conflict wasn't just between my father and me. It had been layered, involving allies, unseen mentors, and quiet supporters all along. My father, visibly shaken now, finally looked at me with something resembling respect. I didn't understand," he said, voice breaking slightly. "I thought I knew your path, your limits. I was wrong." In that moment, the years of tension, rejection, and unanswered questions seemed to converge. I could have used the leverage I had to humiliate him, to settle old scores, but I didn't. Instead, I chose to let the power of truth speak louder than anger. I simply nodded, letting the weight of my accomplishments and his recognition fill the space. But just as I thought the confrontation had reached its peak, the final twist arrived. My father pulled out a letter he had kept hidden all these years. It was from the night I first walked out of that Christmas dinner, a letter he had written but never sent. In it, he admitted that he had been afraid I would surpass him, that he had been insecure about losing control over my future. He confessed regret, not just for what he said, but for the years he had wasted trying to shape me rather than support me. The letter was raw, vulnerable, and completely unexpected. The room went silent again. Even in my victory, there was a new tension. The vulnerability of my father, the reconciliation that had been withheld for years, and the realization that success alone couldn't erase emotional scars. I felt a mix of triumph and empathy. I had achieved everything I set out to accomplish, but the story wasn't just about business or wealth. It was about understanding, forgiveness, and the complexity of family. The gathering ended with no dramatic celebrations, no declarations of ultimate victory. Instead, there was a quiet acknowledgement, an unspoken understanding that things had changed. My father and I had faced the truth of our relationship, and the dynamic between us had shifted. But even as I left the house that night, a sense of suspense lingered. The final twist had shown me that the story of success, rejection, and family was never truly complete. As I walked into the cold night air, I realized that while I had resolved the conflict with my father, the journey was far from over. There were new challenges, new expectations, and new ways to prove myself, not just to him, but to the world and to myself. And in the shadows of that revelation, I caught a glimpse of another surprise waiting, one that promised to test everything I thought I had learned. The story had reached its climax, yet the next chapter was already beginning, charged with suspense, uncertainty, and the promise of yet another twist I hadn't seen coming.